Before introducing this study and the findings in further details, I should first set up the conceptual framework of this study. So this was part of my PhD thesis, which consisted of 4 empirical strands looking at how social media and digital media had been used, so different type of social media platforms have been used during the post-revolutionary debate, most specifically the first presidential election in 2012, as well as the constitutional referendum in Egypt, so after the 2011 uprisings. As part of the different empirical strands that I developed for this research, there was a discourse analysis that was conducted on a sample of data that was extracted from the activist blogosphere, so the pro-revolutionary blogosphere. A content analysis, or rather a thematic analysis, which I'm going to outline today in this presentation, which was conducted on a sample from an e-consultation platform that was set up for the Constituent Assembly at the time, which was called the Dostur Sharik project. And the 2 other empirical strands were a data visualization approach that were used to comment on the way that Egyptian voters have been using search engine and social media to debate about, the constitutional draft as well as the presidential campaign. Finally, I also conducted an ethnographic fieldwork in Cairo in partnership with the American University in Cairo, during which I conducted a couple of face-to-face interviews. So in terms of the strictly theoretical background of this research, I should say that the point of these 4 empirical strands were really to map the process through which Egypt, in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, went through discussing and confronting both different types of counter-discourse versus more institutional forms of discourse. And because from a theoretical point of view, I'm very interested in the process through which some counter-discourse emerge within the civil society to contest dominant powers and progressively turn into a new form of institutional power. So more specifically in the context of a revolution as well as a counter-revolution discourse. So as you can see on the right side, so in terms of what happened in Egypt after 2011, this actually refers to the way that the new, let's say, structure of the post-revolutionary government was to be debated, well, first in the presidential election and afterwards in the constitutional referendum. So in terms of the context of the constitutional referendum, which is going to be the object of this presentation today, I should say that so this happened just after the first Constituent Assembly was dissolved, after the first Parliament was dissolved after being elected, so in 2012. So there was a dissolution of the first Constituent Assembly, after the civil party withdrew and called for a boycott of the first Constituent Assembly. After that, a new Constituent Assembly was to be formed in order to be more representative of the different political groups, including of course, representative of the military regimes, traditionalist parties, including Salafis and also Muslim Brotherhood, as well as representatives from the youth and rather civil parties. So that included the National Salvation Front coalition at the time. In October, there was the issue of the first constitutional draft, so that draft was to be debated to prepare for the referendum. And in November 2012, so Mohamed Morsi, who was the president at the time and representative of the Freedom and Justice Party, so the Muslim Brotherhood, issued this controversial constitutional decree granting himself ultimate power over the parliamentary chambers. And that generated an extremely controversial and polemic environment, as well as conflict of interest between the judiciary, which was in charge of handling the polls station for the referendum, there were a lot of demonstrations around Cairo and Egypt, as well as some clashes on the 5th of December, just in front of the Ministry of Defense. And anyway, so that is just to set up the context in which this referendum was discussed. So it was a highly controversial context. So prior to so during this transition, so during this phase during which, so at the time of this this process during which the referendum was to be discussed and debated, there was a first an e-consultation platform that was set up by an external company that was mandated by the Constituent Assembly to stimulate citizens' participation and allow them to debate the draft of the Constituent Assembly. So that was a platform that was called the Dostor Sharek project. And basically, it was designed for the Constituent Assembly to post the draft of the constitutional article for them to be debated by participants, basically any citizens that would access the platform and post their views on the draft of the Constitution as a comment. And obviously, every time that an article was to be reviewed by the Constituent Assembly, a new version of the draft was uploaded on the platform. So there was a like and dislike option, so people could like or dislike the draft article in a similar way as people can like something on Facebook. And what I did was I contacted, so for the purpose of this research, I basically contacted the company that was in charge of designing this platform for the Constituent Assembly, and they were kind enough to give me access, grant me access to the archive of the comments that had been produced basically over the course of the first constitutional referendum. So that was a considerable amount of data. So I could only record a small amount of comments and only up to 30 articles that had been commented on this platform. And on the basis of this data set, basically, I tried to identify, I went through both discourse and thematic analysis, trying to identify how people raised issues about the draft and whether or not they expressed similar opinions when discussing the draft. So now, in addition to this, I also conducted face-to-face interviews with one of the person in charge of designing this platform, who was not directly working for the government. He was a computer engineer, actually mandated by the government, the Constituent Assembly, to design this platform at first. I conducted another interview with a civil servant who was in charge of implementing campaign to stimulate participation to the referendum, and who at the time was directly involved in the work of the Constituent Assembly, as well as promoting this work in order to make sure to optimize the election turnout, the referendum turnout. So these interviews basically revealed how complex the process was overall, and how difficult it was to get all the different stakeholders to basically be as transparent as possible when posting and promoting, their work within the Constituent Assembly, as well as making sure that all the political groups were represented, including the groups that would be very, I would say, unlikely to call to stimulate participation to the referendum, and more likely actually to call for a boycott of the referendum. So the interviews that I conducted basically underlined different distinctive issues and different phenomena that occurred as the referendum was promoted. One of the first issues was the fact that actually the platform had been used for more political purposes, in order, for instance, to promote one specific political view out of how the constitutional draft should be framed. one of the most controversial constitutional article was Article 2, most specifically in its first version, because the Article 2 of the draft constitution basically was defining the Sharia as the first source for legislation in Egypt. So obviously civil parties and rather secular members of the civil society were calling for, basically they were contesting this article because of the fact that it would turn towards a more conservative type of constitution. But the funny thing was that one of the reason why this article was controversial on the Dostor Sharek platform was because one of the most conservative member of the political debate, who was Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, so a representative of the Noor party, which was a Salafi party, actually asked that the draft could be changed in order to define the Sharia as the one and only source of Egyptian law. So one of the participants commented on this, saying the main thing that happened was that a lot of people used copy-paste, especially for Article 2, the controversial one. And actually, it was a campaign launched by Hazem Salah Abu Ismail. So the fact that people were posting again and again the exact same comment. He had a lot of charisma, so he had a lot of followers. Abu Ismail had a Facebook page with many fans, and he posted on his Facebook page that you have to go to the Sharek, so the platform, and go to the Article 2 and paste this comment. So he laughs. And definitely, this was, if you go to the street, nobody cared, but this was an organized campaign. So they said, in this case, the participant refers to the Constituent Assembly, okay, go there and do this. So we had to go back to the code and not allow saying, if you say something, don't post it again, just sum it up. Because if you post it again, eventually it will be considered as spam. So anyway, it just shows how a tool that is originally used to debate in a participative way can be basically hijacked for political purposes. So another issue that was raised when it came to actually debating the referendum online was how one should define the concepts that had been raised during the revolutionary uprisings. Concepts such as equity, freedom, dignity, social justice, which were in a way referring to, basically they could relate, people could relate to those concepts in very different ways and from very different ideological perspectives. But the main challenge of the constitutional draft was really to define those concepts in a more particular way, and in order for them to be more specific in terms of the ideological approach of the government that was defining them. And those concepts appear to be very controversial as citizens were debating them on the Dostor Sharek platform. So one example was the example of Article 2, which I just mentioned, where Sharia was kind of opposed to the concept of democracy, and how can we basically define our country as a potential democratic state, whereas we refer more to the concept of shura, which are more which conform slightly more in our views to Islamic law, and this type of questions were definitely addressed when it came to comment on Article 2 of the draft. Another article, which was Article 6, came to the same, led people to debate on the same questions, mostly because it discussed the issue regarding to the fact that some political parties should not be based on discriminatory criteria relating to gender, race, or religion. So there was a whole discussion on whether or not Islamist parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, could be considered as democratic because of the fact that they define themselves in relation to the Muslim identity. Another article, which was Article 5, was also very controversial in that sense because it opposed sovereignty of the people, which was directly mentioned as such in the draft article, to what people considered as the ultimate sovereignty, which is the sovereignty of God. And another article, the Article 8, was also very vague in terms of defining other concepts that had been mentioned during the revolution, such as sufficiency or social equity. So people were asking those questions: how can we know what is a sufficient, what are the sufficient resources for people to live? How can we define social equity in a way that is very pragmatic for legislators and these type of things? So finally, there was also the concept of dignity, which had been discussed, as well as social equity again in Article 26, but I'm not going to go in further details into that because we wouldn't have enough time. Now, another quotation that I would like to underline here, on the basis of the interviews that I conducted with those key stakeholders, was the fact that obviously we, as Western observers, have identified the uprisings as a call for democracy from the people. But the funny thing was that the post-revolutionary debate actually demonstrated that many people who were part of the uprisings didn't really participate to the uprisings upholding democracy per se. There were a lot of other values that were probably more, I would say, revealing of their ideological position. And there was this quote from my second interviewee that really illustrates this phenomenon. The opposition to Islamist civil parties, are they called liberals? They want to be called liberals, but they are not. I think the term civil parties is more broad because it's not just liberal parties. You have also left-wing parties, it is secular, but secularism has a very bad reputation in Egypt. Associating liberalism and secularism would suggest atheism, everything, Satanism, homosexuality, and such. So people drive away from these words. We have this famous quote from a movie. It's an old movie that came out in the 80s, beginning of the 90s, of this guy that convinced all the poor illiterate people living in that village that anyone that calls for democracy is an infidel. Someone who don't believe in God, that democracy is not believing in God. There was this illiterate guy, so basically the participant describes the movie. There was this illiterate guy that tries to educate people in order for them to claim for their rights. So this guy, who is almost like a landlord, who owns the land, he said that he was an infidel. One answers, no, he is not. He says, okay, go and ask him if he is a Democrat or not. He will say yes, and this means that he's an infidel. It is a very famous scene. Anyway, so the participant laughs and refers to this piece of this representative piece of popular culture to exemplify the fact that democracy per se is not necessarily considered as compatible with some of the basic grounds for Egyptian culture and the approach to how Islam should be embedded in the constitution and so on. So now, how does this kind of relate to the conceptual framework that I briefly introduced at the beginning of my presentation? What this study demonstrated was that there are a lot of misleading concepts, a misleading vocabulary that was used in the draft of the Constitution, as well as by all the different political groups that were involved in the post-revolutionary debate. And such concepts were, as I mentioned, freedom, equality, dignity, social equity. They were all used in a way that was hardly, that could only make it more vague in terms of when it comes to actually understanding how those different concepts apply to a specific ideological approach. So how could any government implement consistent political transition on the basis of a revolution that was only based on those very vague, highly flexible concepts? And what impact did social media or digital media had on this? Well, what my research demonstrated overall was that in a way social media contributed to raise an illusion, to produce an illusion of consensus on these concepts, to the point that people actually believed at some point that they all understood the concept of freedom, social equity, and dignity. But this was only what I used as what I used to conceptualize this in my own paper was, the distinction between intertextuality and interactivity. Because in the end, this platform was not really interactive. It was only about people posting their own views and their own comment about how they interpreted the draft of the Constitution. But there was not much interactivity in terms of constructing those meanings with others, trying to understand other point of views and trying to negotiate the meaning of those words together. So instead of being a real interactive platform, it was a rather, display of intertextuality. We're all using the same words, and we do believe that there's a consensus on the meaning of those words, but there actually aren't. And that is the conclusion of this study.
Thank you very much for your presentation.